Good afternoon, everyone. Want to start off by welcoming everyone to the webinar today. My name is Charles Jensen. I'm a Senior Vice President with Inland Securities Corporation, and I'm coming to you live from Los Angeles, California. We're joined by many esteemed panelists, including Congressman David Schweikert on the House Ways and Means Committee, who we will introduce very shortly. The topic of our webinar today is Section 1031 of the IRS Code, which allows investors to defer their capital gains on the sale of investment real estate. The very first 1031 exchange was done back in 1921. And to give everyone more perspective, that was the year that Babe Ruth hit his home run record. Today we find the 1031 exchange in the crosshairs of being eliminated, which would have severe economic consequences to our nation. We are here today with our panelists to discuss the future of 1031 exchange, what could happen, and what you could do to help preserve Section 1031 of the IRS Code. Let's start off by introducing Inland, the company I work for. I'm your host today. Inland was started by 4 Chicago school teachers back in the 60s. These 4 teachers were the same educational fraternity. They liked working together, became very dear friends. And back in the 60s, teachers made about $6,000 a year. So they had an idea to supplement their income to buy some real estate on the side. And they started off by teaching at the same school. Back in the 60s, there's no Instagram, no Facebook, no cell phones for that matter. The best way to communicate and to be in touch with each other was to work at the same school. The only phone they had access to back then was a phone in a faculty lounge at the school. They'd make their phone calls, call their realtors. They bought a $4,000 piece of land. It was their first investment between 2 buildings in Chicago. And because our first investment was a piece of land, they call us inland because we're in the land business. This investment, they built a small 4-unit apartment building, and they ended up doubling their initial investment, did very well. You can imagine the teachers in this faculty lounge hearing this story said, "Can we invest with you on your next investment?" They said, "Sure." And thus created the Inland Real Estate Group of Companies. They formed back in 1967. In 1968, we incorporated officially. Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s until today, we bought retail, office, industrial, apartments, medical, storage, land, you name it, we were doing it over the years. One of the interesting parts of the story is by 1989, we became the largest landlord of Walmart nationwide. And my favorite part of the story is that all 4 founders are still at the company today. And we're in Oak Brook, Illinois. We have 5 buildings in a campus with about 1,100 employees. We're just a stone's throw away from McDonald's former headquarters in downtown. And it's a pleasure working for this company, and these people are all great to work with. I wanted to introduce really quick here Mr. Dan Wagner. Dan Wagner is a Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the Inland Real Estate Group of Companies. He's been licensed in real estate broker since 2004 and holds a Series 7 and 63 securities licenses. Wagner serves on numerous real estate industry and governmental boards and committees, including Secretary of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, past President of the Chicago Association of Realtors, and past Commercial Liaison for the National Association of Realtors, to name a few, and PAC Chair for IPA. Wagner obtained his bachelor's and master's degree from Illinois State University. He's married and has 4 children, 3 of whom which are triplets. Dan Wagner, I welcome you to the call today to talk about what Inland is doing with the exchanges. We're a vertically integrated company. We have a mortgage division. We have leasing, asset management. Inland is very well known for our 1031 exchanges. And Dan happens to be the head of government relations for Inland, and he fights for us in DC. So Dan, I give it over to you.
Charles, thank you so much. And what an honor to be here today on this call with Congressman Schweikert especially. I wanted to highlight that I love the introduction of Inland. These 4 teachers, their concept is to have a person like me, a government relations person, to help fight for our industry. And so one of the ways we do that is that I'm kind of like the Tom Sawyer of Inland. My job is to get all of our associations to paint the fence for us. So they have us involved in the U.S. Chamber, the Institute for Portfolio Alternatives, IPA, ADISA, ICSC, the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, NAREIT, and another 800-pound gorilla, the National Association of Realtors. We're working with all these groups all the time to make sure that to be the canary in the coal mine. If there's some issue that comes up, we get to know about it. And one of the things that we have found out is that in February, the Vice President Biden's campaign put their tax policy to the Brookings Institute. This was pre-COVID shutdown. The Brookings Institute evaluated it, and they were able to highlight that one of the things that the Biden campaign wants to do is to provide free health care and child care for people. And the way they wanted to pay for it was through eliminating the 1031 like-kind exchange, eliminating stepped up in basis. So just to name a couple. And we're here because of our education background. We're here to educate elected officials to make sure they're aware why that's not a good idea. And so we, working with all these groups that we talked about, we work together to help fund studies to really analyze what the 1031 means in an empirical way for our economy. And the Ling Petrova and Ernst & Young study were done, and they were able to identify that if the 1031 goes away, it's really the blood and sinew of our economy that really falters. The macro study, the Ernst & Young study, showed that people would not sell, people would sit on their properties, and that would have an impact of reducing the GDP by over $8 billion. And then from a microeconomic study, when you have people doing the 1031s, you have basically the owners maintain and the buyers renovate. And so with every 1031, they identified there are about 30 jobs that are created, and all those jobs go from the realtor, the lawyer, the tax attorney, all the different people all the way down the line that work on properties, on sales of properties. And people, of course, are going to renovate and pay for union folks to fix their buildings and so on and so forth. So that is where you have another exciting thing of about 30% more money, 34% more money is spent on a 1031 versus someone that doesn't do a 1031. And then a variety of other aspects. Farmers use a 1031. Conservation groups use a 1031. We have the issue of fixing areas that are blighted or areas that need to be renovated, use a 1031. So across the spectrum, the 1031 is used all over the place, but it's some people consider it to be the 401k of real estate. And as leaders of the industry, Inland's been in business for over 50 years, and our world knows that the 1031 is really one of the most important things that commercial real estate can have. And it's an honor to be here to talk about this very important topic, because the elected officials, they need to be educated all the time of what the 1031 means to our economy. So without any further ado, why don't we get started, and we just set the table a little bit for our discussion. So Charles, take it away.
Excellent, excellent. I wanted to introduce our all-star list of panelists here today. First, I'll introduce Steve Decker. I'm going to go through all the introductions. We'll go to the questions after the introductions of everyone. Steve Decker is a Senior Vice President, Western Regional Sales Manager for IPX 1031 Exchange, the nation's largest 1031 qualified intermediary. Steve resides in Southern California, is responsible for business cultivation and development nationwide. He's had 17 years working in the exchange industry and has personally assisted over 30,000 exchanges. Our next panelist is Bill Exeter. Bill Exeter is President and CEO of Exeter 1031 Exchange Services LLC and Exeter Trust Company. He's been in the exchange industry for over 36 years. He's one of the founders of the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, or FEA, which helps to protect our industry. Also, we have on the phone Colin Cosgrove, my boss. He's Executive Vice President in the Securities Corporation and National Sales Manager. It's a pleasure to have Colin here today as well. And we also have Rahul Sehgal, Chief Investment Officer and Director of Inland Private Capital, that works with me as well over at Inland. So it's a pleasure to have them all here. And I wanted to introduce also the Congressman this time to bring David in and give him a formal introduction. Congressman David Schweikert is serving his 5th term in the United States Congress. He holds a seat on the House Ways and Means Committee. Having previously served on the Financial Services Committee, he also sits on the Bicameral Joint Economic Committee. He's co-chair of the Valley Fever Task Force with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. He's co-chair of the Blockchain Caucus, co-chair of the Tunisia Caucus, co-chair of the Telehealth Caucus, and David is also formerly the Maricopa County Treasurer. Among his legislative accomplishments, David was instrumental in authoring and passing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. David also played a key role in advancing the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, as member of the Ways and Means Committee and the USMCA whip team, working across the aisle to garner support. David and his wife Joyce enjoy backpacking. They host overnight hikes down the Grand Canyon and are constantly spending time outdoors with their daughter. Welcome, Congressman Schweikert. Also, Congressman Schweikert's a personal friend of mine. I've known him for over a decade, and as well as everyone on this panel.
You need to about double that, Charles.
How long has it been? Maybe 15 years?
It feels like it.
More than a decade. So welcome, Congressman. I go to Steve Decker for the first question. Steve, just need to unmute you here. We'll go to the first question here.
Charles, thank you for the time. We appreciate you having us on to speak with the group today. Congressman Schweikert, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your support. Congressman, you were a strong supporter of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which preserved Section 1031 for real estate. And as Mr. Wagner pointed out just a few moments ago, it appears to be under attack again as the Biden tax plan calls for repeal. What advice would you give to the real estate industry in general as to the actions that we can take to preserve Section 1031 for real estate?
Look, it's a great question, but I need you almost to take a step sideways and think about the environment. If we end up in an environment where the parties change at the White House and change in the Senate, there's going to be a voracious appetite for some new revenues. If I come to you and say, what are some of the easiest places? Changing basis, changing parts of the tax reform, the depreciation, but even, there's been conversations floated around now for a few years of different ways to dial back. You're going to do a 1031, this much of your basis has to go back into a taxable, event. You need to educate every single member of Congress, particularly those of us on the Ways and Means Committee, of what happens to new investments in a time of economic disruption where there's a lot of real estate that needs to become something else. It's an amazing opportunity at the time in our economy for buildings that aren't performing to be rehabbed and become something else. And my personal fear is if we screw around with the 1031, we will stop that from happening. So the fantasy that there's all these tax revenues that would be garnered by some of these changes, I don't believe will happen. But it's going to be a battle because there's lots of oxes out there. Who gets theirs gored?
Very good. Thank you, Congressman. We appreciate it. And as a second question, if you don't mind, as you know, there's obviously ongoing distress in the commercial real estate market across the country. Many real estate sectors, such as hospitality and the business and office space submarkets, are taking an economic hit, to say the least. Many believe that Section 1031 is crucial to maintaining commercial real estate's ability to kind of get to the other side and back on their feet. What is your take on how the next Congress and the administration can make sure that real estate recovers?
Ask me in 25 days or so, once we have an idea of what's happened to the House of Representatives, and the Senate and the presidency, because there's a number of us who believe we need to do some things to keep an eye on and make sure the CMBS markets stay stable, the securitization markets. Maybe even, there's some of us who even have some capital gains spiff legislation to encourage immediate investments. 1031 fits into that world. It's the constant battle, though, of what do you do when you're trying to get the economy revved up again, get that velocity going at the same time. You have a fairly voracious appetite out there for new revenues, for new spending programs. And we'll know in just a couple of weeks, who's going to win that clash. But we need to be brutally honest. The 1031, for many, is an easier place to go. And with a handful of statutory adjustments, you could at least theoretically, capture a hell of a lot of the gained equity that would be taxable out there. And I think that's why there's a desire to go at it.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Next question comes from Bill Exeter, CEO of Exeter 1031 Exchange. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Charles. And Congressman, thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you so much for your service to the country as well. First question I have is, and this is a question that a lot of investors have posed to, I think, all of us, and that is if there's a blue wave in November and the Republicans lose control of the presidency and the Senate, how long do you think it would take in a worst case scenario to eliminate Section 1031?
It's pure speculation. I know some of the folks who watch Washington think it would take almost a year. There would be some econometrics models. You know, our sidecar, we have something called the Joint Tax Committee. That's about 50 econometricians, statisticians, those who do our modeling for the Ways and Means Committee. And you would sort of turn to them and say, how do you avoid a 1988 type issue where, you know, you have tax reform with the change in depreciation, those things, you blow up the commercial real estate market. You, for those old enough, Charles, you're not one of them, to remember the RTC days. You know, I'm from that world. So you may actually have, because I will tell you from a statutory standpoint, you could have something by the end of spring that changes policy. Something, though, that might have a cascade effect on the economy might be a slower rollout and would come near the end of 2021. And you might actually even see sort of an incremental where this much of the basis moves into taxing, then the next year, then the next year. And there's actually some policies floating around out there that that's how it would be approached. I'm still hopeful we can stop it. But once again, we're subject to the election.
And of course, the proposal to eliminate Section 1031 was included in Biden's current plan, but made prior to COVID-19, which of course damaged the economy and the commercial real estate market. Do you think a Biden administration would kind of reconsider that entire plan given COVID-19 and eliminate, or by not eliminating Section 1031?
It's unknowable. Because you almost have to make an argument that here's the constituencies you're willing to crush and here's the ones that you're willing to favor. And we would have to make a very aggressive argument that along with 1031s, but also probably another series of changes in corporate tax rates, in accelerated depreciation going away, a number of the other things that also were proposals from the Democrats when we did tax reform, which were going to be pretty tough on economic growth in the corporate world. Just the reason 1031 sticks its head up is statutorily, mechanically, it's easy. And some of the economists out there think it's a hell of a lot of money. I believe it would do lots of damage, but we have to be able to build that mathematically as an argument.
Thank you, Congressman.
And Congressman Schweikert, your camera is off, but we can hear you just fine, so we'll keep going.
Oh, my camera's off?
Yeah, not a big deal. There it goes. Now it's back on.
Am I back?
You're back for a second, then back off, but we can hear you fine, so I'll let you play with it as we ask the next question here. Next question comes from Colin Cosgrove, Executive Vice President with Inland Securities Corporation and National Sales Manager. And my boss, Colin, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, first of all, thank you, Charles, very much for putting this together. And thank you, Congressman, for all you do in Arizona, specifically District 6. First question for you, Congressman, in your experience, when you see this type of tax change, what is the possibility in the worst case scenario, if this did get abolished, that you would see people get grandfathered who are in their 45 days or who are in their 180 days? Or do you think it would be immediately tax everyone now? Or even a worst case scenario, could they do a look back?
Look, I have to assume even my Democrat brothers and sisters on Ways and Means would act rationally. And those transactions that are in the pipeline would be allowed to be finished. There's also a lot more to this. With the Senate, if we lose the Senate, would there still be the mechanisms to filibuster and slow certain things down? I still have to assume, if a package starts to move, that you have a combination of sort of, and I know this sounds very partisan, but I believe it's quite real. The Democrat activists who've now become members of Congress, who are very aggressive and basically want to end most of the tax reform as we know it, and others who have just certain adjustments they want to make for transitions. And so there'll be, that sort of battle of hopefully some rational math.
Yeah. So just to further that, Congressman, we know that passing this is difficult. You just mentioned that, and the likelihoods, if the Democrats have both houses, they have the House and the Senate, that this could happen. But what's the chances of compromise, and what are some of those changes that could be limited, or what would you propose that could be limited that wouldn't abolish it altogether?
I'm going to give you a somewhat radically different view from mine. And look, when you represent Scottsdale, Phoenix, we're a high growth area. Much of the money coming out of 1031s are coming to my community, as real estate is sold in the different coasts, because you see the demographic movement. But I'm also take a different view that using coverage on basis, some capital gains incentives, some things on 1031s, maybe even extending out some times, is actually another way to incentivize the country getting its feet back underneath it. Is there a way to look at some of these tax code items as a pro-growth approach, pro-economic development? If the country is about to go through sort of a disruption on the performance of retail space compared to certain industrial space, compared to multifamily, compared to, if there's really a rotation in the economy, and a fairly aggressive one because of COVID, wouldn't you want to build the tax incentives to allow that to actually happen in a fairly elegant way, instead of just, having so many investors hit a wall? So look, I'm still very optimistic that the Senate remains Republican. I've seen some numbers, and they swing back and forth almost daily, that in the House we may actually gain seats. And so the closer that margin is, the more negotiating leverage we have.
Thank you, Congressman.
Okay, next, I want to bring on Rahul Sehgal, who is the Chief Investment Officer for Inland Private Capital, to ask a question.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us and for everything that you've done for the country and for the industry. I'd just like to expand on a few questions that were asked before. Being part of Inland Private Capital Corporation and having such a diverse portfolio, we've obviously seen quite a bit of challenges in the second quarter and the beginning of the third quarter of this year. In your opinion, and looking at the contraction in our gross domestic product, and obviously how the lack of real estate transaction activity has contributed to that, do you think that there has been any change in views on the political side from either party? And do you believe that that may continue as we are looking to try and expedite the overall economic recovery into 2021 and as we emerge out of 2020?
It's actually a difficult question. Washington, D.C. in many ways has become sort of a math-free zone. It's shocking how much public policy is often made by feelings. I still believe the Ways and Means Committee is one of the last places where there's adults. We have really good, bipartisan staff that does a lot of the modeling. You have to come at this question from a slightly different angle, though. How many will get elected in this cycle and want to go immediately to their agenda? And how many will want to immediately go to sort of what our, as a Republican, previous agenda was, which was maximizing economic expansion, economic growth? Because there are almost two different views of the world there that, you know, I believe we had remarkable economic growth in 1819, and it was very well distributed across society, where the working poor were doing substantially better than any time in modern economic history. A lot of my brothers and sisters on the other side of the aisle don't see that world. They actually look for much more interventionism. And look at enterprise zones. How many of us see them optimistically, and then look at how much of the rhetoric on the other side sees them as almost something to get rid of.
Very good point. Thank you.
All right, just a quick service announcement for everyone here. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask questions, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A button, and we will ask them as soon as we finish off with the panelists here. And Congressman Schweikert, your video's off again, but we can hear you great. So,
did my video go off?
Yeah, again, probably some sort of
back?
Let's see here. It is not back yet, but we can hear you just fine. So we'll continue as normal here. We go to our next panelist, Dan Wagner, the Senior Vice President with Government Relations at Inland, to ask you a couple questions. We can see you again, Congressman.
Thank you, Congressman. I wanted to highlight with the COVID-19, the local and state governments are experiencing some challenging times. And then with the elimination of the 1031, they would also have reduced amounts of transactions. And obviously with transactions come transfer taxes, so additional lost revenue. Can you comment on what you think the House Ways and Means Committee would do to address this issue?
I believe it would probably be looked at, let's say we had status quo. You know, Democrats control the House, Republicans control the Senate, White House up in the air. There are a package of ideas, a handful of us have been working on in a bipartisan fashion to maximize economic growth, particularly over the next 2 years. There's opportunities within that, particularly for the investing class, but it does mean being somewhat nimble. I just can't tell you what of those is capable of moving forward until you give me the numbers of what the House looks like and the Senate looks like after the election. But there's a really interesting sort of, Dan, there's an interesting sort of philosophical, is the point of the next year to maximize economic growth to try to get back to a sense of normality? Or is it to maximize new policy to go with a different vision of what the country should look like? And that's not, I'm not being rhetorical. I think that's in many ways the election that's before you.
Well, it is definitely interesting times, and I appreciate you being able to opine on these topics. I know that we've been, as you heard earlier, working really hard to educate people about the 1031. With our education through the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, the IPA, National Association of Realtors, have you heard of your fellow members of Ways and Means Committee talking about the 1031? Are Republicans, Democrats, are they discussing any of these issues amongst you or talking about that?
There are discussions on, you know, from our side, trying to figure out where the left would go for looking for revenues. You know, from the media standpoint, because it's just easy to talk about corporate tax rate, but the world's more complicated than that. You know, you have to actually sort of dig down to, you know, where some of the real money is. You know, because you could raise corporate tax rates, but if you allow certain types of other accommodations, if you're smart, you could move certain things around. On the Democrat side, the playbook we've been more looking at is some of the amendments and discussion that happened when we did tax reform. And that's where, you know, 1031 actually had its sort of moment of exposure. So do we see also that playbook brought back up?
Okay. Thank you, Congressman.
Congressman, the next question, 2 questions come from me, and then I'll take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please write it out in the Q&A box below. Congressman, do you think the threat of eliminating 1031 exchanges is valid or only a threat? Some say this is a way to bring Republicans to the bargaining table on other issues. Is this just a bargaining chip?
I actually don't think it is. And I'll give you 2 reasons, and you're not going to like either of the responses. It's a hell of a lot of money. And it's more than just a 1031 exchange. It's also trying to find other ways to go at the gain that investors and different organizations have. But also the 1031 exchange community is actually relatively small. So therefore, where can you find the maximum amount of tax revenues, receipts, at the same time find a audience that's smaller, so you're not, lobbied out of, the size of the lobbying prowess. So those are some of the things that get in play is, how big a response would you get compared to some of the other taxes? Simple example, change 1031, change some of the tax or the taxations on basis and gain or corporate tax hike. Which one brings a larger audience to your door? And so it's a combination of how much lobbying prowess and the perceived revenues it will bring.
And my final question before we go to the listeners is, what can each of the listeners on the webinar today and viewers do to preserve Section 1031 exchange? What can we do?
First answer is a bit political. Find people that understand what you do, see it as a good for society, a good for economic growth, the right and fair thing to do in a tax code, and help them. And I know that's a bit self-serving on my part, but it's true. The other side is if you see any good studies, reports, documentation that walk through the secondary effect, second degree effects, third degree effects when an exchange happens. The rehab of the building, the new TIs, the new availability for whatever that new capital investment in the community is. We need to also tell the story that there's much more than just someone rolling their bases. There's also sort of economic vitality that comes with these.
Dan Wagner, you're still on the call here. Would you mind talking about that study? Did we go over that study already? About how much it would cost if we got rid of exchanges?
Yeah, what's good is that Ernst & Young study that was done in the 2015 and also the Ling Petrova studies are also being redone. And then the National Association of Realtors did a study just recently where they verified that over 61% of realtors in the last 3 years have done a 1031. So it's amazing the amount of people that are engaged in this. And I know that that we'll be ready to go door to door talking with every member of Congress about this. So we did kind of go into it in the very beginning. So if you want to get to questions, that'd probably be good, Charles.
Excellent. And we'll be sure to share that with you, Mr. Congressman. First question from the audience comes from Steve. He asks, approximately how many Senate seats would the Democrats need to win in order to amend or end the 1031 exchange? I assume that a few of them would not go along with it. So how many Senate seats would the Democrats have to pick up?
Could be 4. Please understand, we all would think of 1031 as a freestanding item. But if it's in a package of tax reforms, that's how you would move something of this nature. It would be rolled in with dozens and dozens of other provisions, some that might buy certain votes, gain certain votes, and some that would hurt other areas. And let's be a little brutal on this. Think of some of the business all of you have been doing when you look at some of the national trends. Where are some of the sales happening and where are some of the new investments happening? And then think about, are those blue or red? And it gives you sort of a sense of also the perception of the movement in our society, where investment is going. and where it's leaving. And you could actually see where there could be some politics just even in that.
Got it. Next question comes from John Harvey. He says the initial Biden tax plan proposed eliminating 1031 for taxpayers earning more than $400,000 in taxable income. Is the $400,000 annual income floor, which would preserve the 1031 for the majority of taxpayers, still in play?
Don't know. You assume that's part of the original plan, but until you actually get down to pencil and paper, you know, as we always say, we have a lot of great ideas until you're trying to write it into statutory language. And then you start to realize how difficult it really is.
Dan Wagner, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I was going to highlight that the Real Estate Roundtable, which Ryan McCormick and Jeff DeBoer, they've done a great job evaluating it, and they actually think that through their analysis that 400,000 is going to go away, and it's just going to be in general just eliminated. So that was just what I just got from them recently. But the congressman is right. It would, by the time you get through those details, it would, in all likelihood, basically be eliminated.
Next question from Philip Clark. Would you consider the 1031s a primary political football for negotiations? In the event of a lost Senate, would Republicans give in to this reform to negotiate other areas like this and that? Would you consider at risk for reform we aren't thinking about?
I'd love to sound like I have a brilliant answer to that question. But I can wax eloquent on it, but I just don't know. It matters on how many other provisions of the regulatory tax code definitions are in play to figure out how prominent 1031 would be in the debate.
Got it. The next question is, automotive car makers used to take advantage of the 1031 market with their automotive leasing programs as well as the airline industry. Do these other industries still benefit from 1031 exchanges? And are there any other industries that also utilize 1031 exchanges with large volume that would stand with the real estate industry? This could go to Congressman or Dan or both.
Dan, I'll let you, and then I'll editorialize a little on this one.
I was writing something else down. What was the bottom line, Charles?
So they're talking about, you see exchanges for, automotive and airline. Yeah. And do these industries still benefit from 1031 exchange,
no.
which is no. And the question is, are there any other industries that also utilize 1031 exchanges with large volume that would stand with the real estate industry?
Well, so the interesting aspect, who are the people that are allies? Obviously, all the real estate organizations we talked about, but the American Farm Bureau, the farmers, this is a big deal for the farm world, and then the conservation groups. I was told writing years ago when the 1031 was going to be taken out, that the conservation world all came to the rescue of it as well. Mm-hmm. So that was so those are some of our allies, but I think that we have really educate as many people as we can, and everybody that supports the 1031, you need to get to know who your congressman is. That's for sure.
And Dan, I will tell you, some of the most interesting presentations we had were some of the real estate portfolio managers for some of the very large insurance organizations who would come in and say, we actually use some of this product or the statute to constantly balance our risk profiles, our regional distribution, our real estate type, to try to stay in compliance with certain risk profiles for long-term life insurance and those things. And it's something often we don't think about, at least from our side, of how there's this constant balancing of, you buy a building, now you have too much of that type of office building in the country, you exchange it for something else to have, different types of mixes. And in a world with such low yields right now, I had assumed we would actually start to see more velocity of those types of exchanges and not less.
I think you brought up a really good point. People don't necessarily realize that these large, these large REITs, for example, that many of the pension funds are invested in, utilize this to absolutely restructure their portfolios. And who benefits from that? And that's, you know, mom and pops that are using this as mailbox money for their, you know, their groceries. And that's a really good point, Congressman. Thank you for bringing that up.
Congressman, the next question comes from Greg. And the question is if Vice President Biden won, would he just simply try to repeal the tax cuts from 2017?
I'm not sure it would come as much from the White House as members of Congress and the Senate. And it turns out when you do a complex piece of legislation, there's some portions that I think are almost bipartisan and other parts that one party supports, the other party doesn't. So it's more than just repealing the 2017 tax reform. You will actually see, you're already hearing it in the debates, we want to raise corporate taxes here, but we want to maybe provide an incentive for these types of activities. So as always, you know, a member of Congress can never stop wanting to, you know, tinker around with the tax code. And then you actually have other strange things. We're having to deal with the international side of the tax code, because many of the, you know, when we leaped as a country way ahead of much of the industrialized world, a number of countries in the rest of the world now are catching up with us in a competitive tax code. And will that actually even end up in the debate?
Ahmed asked a good question. He says, the 1031 exchange survived during all Democratic administrations for the last 60 years. What's different now? It's lasted for 100 years or 60 years under Democrats. What's different today?
The nature of the politics, the desire for revenues, the scale of the national debt, and the political promises that have been made in this campaign cycle for substantial new types of spending. It is, look, it's a different environment than I've ever experienced.
Cynthia asks, how can you see us educating Congress on how many jobs are created by continuing 1031 versus the economic loss we would have without it, as many sellers would just hold on to the properties and we would lose jobs and hurt the economy?
That's for those of us who are familiar with this world. And Charles, I don't know if we disclosed, you know, in a previous life, you know, I was involved in a number of these. We're going to have to make an argument that here's the positive economic growth velocity, however you like to say it, it brings to the country. But there will be some regionalism in that debate of, hey, people are trying to leave my area because of tax demographics, whatever it is, and they're putting money into you, Schweikert, in Arizona, so you're benefiting from this. The reality of it is the politics are more complicated than just, we can demonstrate that it's a net economic positive for our nation. There are some regions that may benefit more and some that may benefit less from that incentive to sell and incentive to invest.
From Rob, he asks, why was the 1031 business exchange taken out in the last tax update?
A combination of a pay for, combination of some issues in regards to tracking and documentation. Yeah, I'm not sure I can describe some of the other items, but I know there were some real, you know, when you also have a world of accelerated depreciation, you know, almost immediate depreciation, there was some argument that that was very expensive and that actually accomplished some of the incentives.
And Congressman, didn't also like artwork and yachts and things like that, also people were thinking that shouldn't be, you shouldn't.
Yeah, and you know there's a capital gains difference between, you know, some of the fine art holdings and those things. And well, oddly enough, that's one of my other projects, is trying to fix some of those discrepancies.
All right, John asks, does the Biden plan proposal eliminate 1031 exchanges just prospectively, or would it retroactively unwind prior 1031 exchanges as a result in the taxability of previously deferred gains? This was asked you earlier, but I think if we can elaborate.
Yeah, I think it would be my understanding for the future. And we've also had the question of how quickly could such a thing happen? And a little bit of that is hopefully would matter on the makeup of the Senate, the House, and also the economic impact.
Okay, next question. Most real estate is owned in LLCs, treated as partnerships. The tax law has allowed stock for stock tax-free exchanges for years. Is there any appetite on the Republican side to push for tax-free exchanges of part of interest and or fractional partnership interest? The lack of allowing tax-free exchanges of partnership interest hurts the like-kind exchange of real estate held in partnerships.
The answer, yes, it's been in conversation. Believe it or not, it's actually really hard to draft. And you'd have to actually set aside a series of rules of, making sure that parties that, you truly had separate and not common parties.
Got it. Steve asks a good question. He says, among other Biden tax proposals are a harsher estate tax and elimination of basis step up. To the extent you can, please compare the strength of constituencies opposing these changes with the strength of the constituencies opposing further changes to 1031.
Okay, and forgive me, I didn't hear the complete question, but my instinct is if the White House changes parties and the Senate does also you will see a substantial change in estate taxes. And so in some ways, that's the universal answer to your question.
Panelists, do you have other questions? Feel free to jump in. If you have a question, go and ask the Congressman.
Congressman, this is Dan Wagner. During the 2017, the ultimate tax reform proposal, the Republicans did look at eliminating the 1031 exchange, and obviously they did it for the personal property, and because they had 100% expensing for items. So giving us advice, giving us a primer of what were some of the arguments that worked for you? What were some of the key things that that really are kind of the arrows in our quiver that we need to keep pounding on? I like to think it was partially also having someone like myself in the room who was very familiar with sort of both the process and some of the economics, making an argument that this may be seen as the pay for that we would receive from it, but do we really understand the impairment we would do to economic growth around the country if we did such? And sometimes, one of the greatest things you get when you go through these complex negotiations, people don't realize tax reform, we were in small rooms for a year. Sometimes we would think we had a brilliant idea. We would send it to our economic modelers. 2 days later, they would come back and tell us we blew up the world economy because they would find ways where there was leakage. So when you do tax policy, there's an interlinking, obviously, where you do one thing over here, it's going to affect something else. In regards to avoiding those discussions and moving away from in 2017, I think it was a combination of the economics and the fact there was a couple of us in the room that truly believed being able to move that basis was actually ultimately good for the economy.
Go
ahead.
Just a quick question, Congressman. I thought the QOZ efforts that have gone out, it was just a great bipartisan effort by Congress. Do you still see support for the QOZ on both sides? A great way to defer taxes and have a step up in basis. Do you think that will be extended, or do you think that will be something that will be negotiated and looked at the next year?
I think there's support for those who understand it. And once again, depending on the election, Who knows? Everything may be subject to some type of negotiation.
Congressman, the folks on this, obviously on this call, all the participants clearly have an interest in preserving the 1031 exchange. What's your advice to everybody out there in listing land? If they want to preserve it, give us some tips in your experience of the best way to work with people like yourself to try to
find people who either support you and support them. If you have someone who doesn't understand, if you're on, the Armed Services Committee, you're probably not bathing in the tax code every day.
Yeah.
Find that if that's your member of Congress, find a way to go have a coffee with them. One of the most powerful things that can happen is building relationships, particularly if you have something that many will perceive as complex. In some ways, this isn't that complex, but there's only a couple handfuls of members who sit on the tax writing subcommittee. So our life is bathing in this. Other members have other interests, the diversity of their districts. Meet your member, tell your story. If you lean to the left and your member is a Republican, you don't have to do the politics of it, you can do the economics of it, and vice versa. But it's important that the industry is building relationships, because there's other things that are in the tax code, tax provisions, that have much larger constituencies, who are much more politically active. And that's often what you're up against when a package is being put together.
In regards to like a schoolhouse rock, how a bill becomes a law with tax bills, it first goes to, could you explain, it goes to the House Ways and Means Committee, and then, because they have the jurisdiction, could you talk a little bit about just the mechanics of it?
Yeah, the Constitution mentions only one committee, and it's functionally the Ways and Means Committee. Revenue bills all start there. But in some ways, it sort of starts backwards. Here's the programs we are implementing. Here's the revenues we want. And so sometimes it's revenues chasing the programs as much as what would create a pro-growth tax code. Because there's many in Congress who see the tax code as an opportunity to produce what they perceive as fairness over what others look at as maximizing economic opportunity, if that makes sense. So some use the tax code to punish, others use to incentivize.
And then once the House Ways and Means Committee decides on what they want to do, then where does it go? You vote it out. You sometimes, if there's multiple pieces of complication, there may be segments of that legislation that have other jurisdiction. You get it out of the House and it goes over to the Senate, and the Senate Finance Committee. Typically, if you're doing a complex bill, you're running some parallel tracks. The House needs to pass it because it needs to originate in the House. But that doesn't mean that the Senate hasn't also been moving at the same time and takes your bill and attaches what they have. And then you can end up in negotiations back and forth between the House and the Senate. And that process, normally, as you talked about, it took a long time for you guys to pass something, but you think during that, with this process in place, it would take at least a year to possibly get.
And there's sort of both the fragility and the opportunity. You figured the previous big tax reform was 1986, and it took till 2017 to do a major tax revision. There's both on the right and the left, there's a powerful economic argument that tax reform should happen much more often because the nature of the economy changes, the technology in the economy changes, but also those people around, those countries around the world we compete with also change their tax codes. And the US tax code had absolutely calcified, and it was why so much economic vitality, capital was leaving our country, going to other places around the world because we had been outcompeted in other countries' tax codes. So my expectation is for the coming decades to actually see tighter cycles of tax reform policy. But if the Biden plan, where they want to raise corporate taxes, you walk in and say, we want this. At the same time that happens, once that's open, there's a whole bunch of other desires within the tax code.
Gotcha.
I know for advocacy, there's a website, 1031.org. 1031.org. You can go in the advocacy portion of the FEA and look at some of the issues surrounding this. Congressman, what's the best website for constituents to go on to figure out who their congressman is and to contact them?
For all members of Congress?
Yes.
You basically, if you're not sure who your member of Congress is, you can actually, right on the internet, look up, put in your address and say, who's my member of Congress? And that will provide you links to their official office. In all of our worlds, we operate sort of these two parallel tracks. We have our official world, which is our staff that does research, does constituent services. And then we have our world, particularly in election years, of here's our website where we raise our money, we tell our story, we try to build relationships with our voters. So if you're wanting to give money, you're obviously going to the political website. If you're wanting to just try to get on someone's schedule and you have no interest of doing the type of political support, go through the official side.
Got it. And I think Dan, we probably urge everyone to contact their congressman or woman and, support the 1031 exchange. The final question, because we're coming up on the hour here to wrap up here. Congressman, I know you're in an election right now, and I know you need all the support you can get. How would people reach out to you and support you? Do you have a website? Yeah,
and I'll do two things. I have a difficult last name. It's Schweikert. It's SCHWEIKERT. And our website is just davidschweikert.com. You can help us through that. But if also someone has something else I can help with, or questions, or you want to know, and I know we have a lot of folks on the line, but I'll give you my phone number. And if you want to contact us, on the political side, my personal cell, because we don't like political calls going through the official office. My personal cell is 602-619-3330.
Wow, thank you. Well, I just want to thank everyone. Congressman Schweikert, it's such a pleasure to have you on for the hour here. And this is a pressing issue for everyone on the 1031 exchange. I want to thank all of our panelists, Mr. Steve Decker with IPX 1031 Exchange. Steve, thank you so much for all your help with the call today. Mr. Bill Exeter, CEO of Exeter 1031 Exchange, Dan Wagner, the SVP Government Relations at Inland, Colin Cosgrove, Executive Vice President, National Sales Manager, Rahul Sehgal, our CIO over at Inland. I want to thank everyone for being on the call today. Really appreciate it. And I hope you all join us for a future call. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bill,
Charles.
have a great afternoon.
Charles.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Charles. Great job. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Congressman.